We're delighted to have with us tonight Dean Sherzai, MD, and Ayesha Sherzai, MD. Dean Sherzai, MD, and PhD, is co-director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Program at Loma Linda University. Ayesha Sherzai, MD, is a neurologist and co-director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Program at Loma Linda University. She is also a trained plant-based culinary artist. Their presentation tonight is entitled Preserving Brain Health, Impact of Nutrition on Alzheimer's. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ayesha Sherzai and Dr. Dean Sherzai.
So this little brain, this little 3-pound organ, 2% of body's weight, is amazing for many reasons. But most importantly, it has 87 billion neurons and potentially 1 quadrillion connections. And I could just end the conversation right there. Work towards getting your brain to make 1 quadrillion connections and you're fine. You're gonna withstand anything. Now, what does that mean? How do we do that? And we'll talk about that. Now, the problem is, oh, by the way, its processing power is 1 times 10 to the 50th power, more powerful than any supercomputer. And it runs on a 9-volt battery. Not really, but equivalent thereof. It's an amazing tool. And we are, you know, when they say we only use 10% of the brain's capacity, they're wrong. We're using 100% of the brain's capacity, but at 1% efficiency. So there's the opportunity. The problem is that this little brain also consumes 25% of body's energy. Now, there are bigger brains than ours. The blue whale has a brain that's 17 pounds. It's huge, as well as convoluted and has all these, you know, connections and neurons. So, and the elephant, same thing. They're brilliant, beautiful animals. They're much more conscious than we give them credit. But the one difference is the energy utilization is much different. The highest energy utilization after the humans are the whales, which is 10%. So the human brain is overwhelmed. This little brain was not expected to live up to 80, 90, 100, or beyond. We were expected to run around, usually run away from saber-toothed tigers, find a mate, if we could, then reproduce and die. And not always in that order. But the problem is that, and the average age up to just a few decades ago was in the 30s. If we think that's an incredible number, just go to Somalia. We've been to Afghanistan, Somalia, and other places. Right now, the average age is 40, 48 to be exact in these countries. So us living to 80, 90, and beyond is a new thing. And that's fine because we can, this brain has the redundancy and connectivity to withstand any assault if we do the right things, if we maintain the right environment that can maintain incredible cognitive capacity well into 80s, 90s, and well beyond. 2 of the examples are people we know, which is Jane Goodall and Dr. Wareham. Dr. Wareham is a cardiothoracic surgeon at Loma Linda who did surgeries up to age 95. Are there any doctors here? Okay. He did open to close surgeries up to age 95. Open to close, meaning a lot of times as doctors get older, they stand and give guidance. He did open close, and he retired at 95 because he wanted to travel. Now, he's as active as always. At 103, he's incredibly active. The same thing with Jane Goodall. Some of her best work is in her 80s, 70s, and 80s. And Linus Pauling, one of the greatest minds of our time. You should read his writings later in life. And Picasso and many others, although Picasso, nobody knows it was better or worse. But in any case, I'm joking, he's phenomenal. So it's now we do realize that you can have vibrant brain life well into your later life. But we have to face this tsunami, this dilemma, dementia. Before we go any further, let me answer the question that a lot of people usually have, which is what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? Dementia is the big category. Alzheimer's is a subtype. So there are many types of dementias. You have Lewy body dementia, you have vascular dementia, you have Parkinson's dementia, you have frontotemporal lobe dementia, you have Alzheimer's dementia. As it happens, Alzheimer's is the biggest one. Anywhere between 70 to 80% of all dementias is Alzheimer's. So that's the one that we hear about the most. That's the biggest fear in America. In fact, the statistics show that people are afraid of Alzheimer's more than they're afraid of death. So there are many reasons, there are good reasons to believe that. So now the problem is it's the fastest growing epidemic in America and first world. It's the third leading cause of mortality and morbidity in the United States, #1 in UK and in Japan and other European countries. And it's fast growing to become #1. Every 66 seconds, a person is being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. That number actually underestimates the true nature, the true number, because a lot of populations, in a lot of populations, it's actually not diagnosed. People just live with it and family takes care of it, but they're never diagnosed. And right now, 5.3 million people suffer from Alzheimer's in the United States alone. As we've done well with mortality from other diseases, such as diabetes, heart disease, HIV, and many other cancers, and just in the last 10 years, the mortality from Alzheimer's has grown by 89%. That graph should shock everybody. 1 in 10 individuals over the age of 65 have dementia, and that number doubles every decade thereafter, until at age 85, nearly 50% of people have dementia. Now, women suffer disproportionately from this disease. 1 in 6 women in their lifetime will be diagnosed with Alzheimer's and dementia in general, and 1 in 11 men. Part of this is because they live longer than men, but that explains just part of the story. There's much more to it. We're studying that as far as the hormonal aspects, the vascular aspects as well. So we want to, and then also there's a cohort effect, meaning the individuals that are getting to us now at this age are, when 80 years back, women were not as challenged cognitively and educationally, so that might have a little bit of an effect as well. So we'll talk about all of that. The cost of Alzheimer's is bewildering. The second costliest disease in America is heart disease at $100 billion. Third is cancer, all cancers, at $57 billion. The direct cost of Alzheimer's is $259 billion. Indirect cost, another $240 billion. That's today. That number will grow to $3 trillion by 2050. $3 trillion by 2050. And the number in US will grow to 16 million, 115 million worldwide by 2050. Actually, prior to that, that's actually optimistic numbers. $3 trillion will not only collapse our healthcare system, but will collapse our system in general. So we better do something to prevent and treat Alzheimer's now. The big myths. The big myth is that Alzheimer's cannot be prevented in general. Dementia cannot be prevented in general. That's a big myth because we've been focusing on one molecule, amyloid, and now the second one, tau, for decades and decades. And we're not saying that that's not involved. Definitely, it's a part of the disease. It's a marker of the disease. It's a downstream marker of disease progression. But after hundreds of billions of dollars of research, our success rate has been 0% as far as prevention. We have drugs that actually treat the symptoms. They don't even slow down the disease. None of the pharmaceutical companies ever claimed that the drugs such as Aricept and Namenda and all these actually slow the disease. They just affect the symptoms for a few years, but the curve of the disease continues at the same rate. So again, focus on amyloid and tau. The second myth is that it's a genetic disease. Is it a genetic disease? Yes, everything has a genetic component. Even if you get in a car accident, there's a component of genetics in that, how, your reflexes and so on and so forth. But there are diseases that are heavily driven by genes, such as Huntington's disease. If your father has Huntington's and you're a son, and we know what on chromosome 4, what happens, how many repeats of CAG will mean that you'll get it at this age, at this, with these symptoms. We know this. But that's a disease that's heavily driven by genes. Sickle cell, we know specifically where. But for a great majority of chronic diseases, genes are not the determinant, there's not one gene that determines the disease. It's a slew of genes that give you risk range. So the newest tools in genetic studying in Alzheimer's have given us these set of genes as those that influence disease risk. The ones on the left, presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and APP, are the ones that are almost like the Huntington gene. If you have these genes, you're going to get it during your life. You can move it back and forth a little bit, but not much. But those three genes constitute 3% of all Alzheimer's. 3%, no more than that. And a lot of them are in families that you can actually recognize in South America and other places where you go to these villages and entire families have Alzheimer's in their 50s. APP is a Down syndrome gene. Patients with Down syndrome, individuals with Down syndrome have 3 chromosome 21s, and therefore their APP component is tripled. If they live long enough, they almost all get Alzheimer's. We just wrote a paper with a young man, which will be published soon, that shows that even in those patients, genetically driven disease, if high blood pressure, cholesterol, and diabetes is taken care of, the disease is pushed back further, significantly. So even in that population. So what about the other 90 to 95%? 90% of Alzheimer's can potentially be delayed past normal age. What's normal age? 80 to 85, right? And that's not a profound statement. We know this, that you can push it back. As I said, the path that we've taken has been a failure 100% of the time. We've cured many mice with 70 different things, including blueberries, cured mice from Alzheimer's. But the mice are not men, so we'd never translate it to humans. So why is it that we keep going back to the pill, to the easy answer? Because we're a pill society. I mean, the studies show that even patients that say they don't like medicine, when they go to a doctor that give them a pill and one that didn't give them a pill, guess which one got the higher rating? The one that gave the pill. Because it's easy. It's an easy answer. I don't have to do the walking. I don't have to do all the lifestyle change. So we have to change that mentality, because these are the two roads that we have to lead. One of them, the way it's going now, goes to cognitive decline at age 30 or so. So our cognition starts declining from very early. So that's why, in fact, we have started this. The kids have written a book on kids' health and brain health, because we really have to start from very early age. We have, in certain populations, San Bernardino and others, we have type 2 epidemic in children, something that was never type 2 diabetes epidemic in children, as well as we know as far as fat consumption and everything else. So the cognitive decline starts early until in 60 years of age or so, people start sensing a memory disorder that's a little more than usual. You know, not just losing the keys here and there or forgetting where the car was parked, a little more than that. They still can do everything, but they're having a little more problem than usual, and even others are noticing. That's MCI, that's mild cognitive impairment. When people have mild cognitive impairment, their risk of dementia goes up significantly. Even in that population, 50% don't develop it, and we believe that if you catch it even at this stage, you can reverse it through lifestyle. And then comes dementia, or particular types of dementia, either Alzheimer's or others. And actually much more common, an understated version is vascular dementia. And we give talks in many, many, many churches. And when elderly men past the age of 65 come, we can detect, we're not very fun in parties, two neurologists, we can detect that this person has vascular dementia, this person has Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So we see this very early and ubiquitously. And it's not stated in any statistics. So we really have to start acting at the community level to start making change. So when we did research, oh, by the way, the green line, that's a reality. So every study show that individuals that maintain a good diet and all the other lifestyles that we'll be talking about, they continually improve their cognition. Even the speed of processing, memory, executive function, everything continues to improve. That concept of wisdom, well, we don't want to use the word wisdom, but it's much more than that. because your speed, your knowledge, you know, last time I said this, are there any 18-year-olds in this room? No. I literally mean this. When an 80-year-old is a different species from an 18-year-old, as far as just presence and consciousness. So we want to make sure that we maintain that through lifestyle and through health. So our research in Loma Linda and also in NIH and Columbia, Ayesha that work in Columbia, show that there are many factors, but 4 major factors that are the determinant of cognitive health and the reality of all health. By the way, the reason that we were avoiding the brain because we thought the brain was very different from other organs. It's not. It's the same vascular organ, immune system. You know, now even we know that it has lymphatic system, everything the same, but much more so, 1,000,000 times more so. So if the heart has vascularity, the brain has 1,000,000 times more vascularity. In fact, when people come to me and they haven't had a stroke or dementia, we look at the MRI, we now see vascular disease, microvascular disease early. I wish we could actually show people in their 50s that you are starting to have microvascular disease. You don't have a stroke yet, that's why you're not going to the hospital. But this should be a warning to start the process now. So the 4 processes that are involved are inflammation, oxidation, glucose dysregulation, and lipid dysregulation. Now, these are not in reality very separate processes. This is a closed system. They're all interconnected. Some of them more, some of them less. In fact, inflammation seems to be downstream effect of a lot of these things, but and lipid dysregulation seems to be a little more important, but they're all interconnected, and people come to the disease from different pathways. People who have chronic trauma to the head, you know, traumatic brain injury, they have a little more inflammation and vascular disease. People who have diabetes have more glucose dysregulation and its effect on the brain and amyloid deposition. And people who have lipid disorders and cholesterol abnormalities come to it from other direction. So what's the way out of this? Is it a pill? This cannot be. The way out of this cannot be a pill. It's too complex. The brain is not too complex. So every time we say this, oh, forget about it, the brain is too complex. That's a way to just give up. It's not. No, the brain is not too complex. The pathway out of the diseases of the brain is too complex for a pill. If there is ever going to be a pill, it's going to be a series of pills at different stages of life and personalized for you. But here's a pill that will tell you how you can get out of it. It's lifestyle. The things that affect glucose dysregulation, lipid dysregulation, oxidation and inflammation, it's the same things. It's nutrition, it's exercise, stress or stress management, it's sleep. Sleep is a big one, and mental activity. Mental activity is the biggest one. We'll talk about each of these. But today we'll focus a little more on nutrition, and I'll be very quick on the other ones, very quick. So whenever you write a book, you have to come up with an acronym, they told us. So this is the best we could do. We're not very creative. Well, she's creative. She's a singer, but I'm not. So neuro, but it's a good one. N is nutrition, E is exercise, U is unwind. And that's important because it's not about stress elimination. It's actually, to be honest, the next book I want to write is, we want to increase your stress. Living a stressful life is good for you, but it's the kind of stress, the good stress. We'll talk about that for a few seconds. Restorative sleep, not just sleep. I can knock all of you guys out, but it doesn't mean you went through the phases of sleep. So it's restorative sleep, and it's profoundly important. And the most important, optimizing mental activity. Brains that have kept themselves active throughout life are profoundly protected. So if you're retiring, don't retire, or at least go to something else that keeps your mind just as active. So we'll talk about that as well. So now, 20 minutes, that's as quick as I've ever gotten it done. So now Ayesha will do most of the talk from here on.
Thank you, Dean. Okay. So let's talk about nutrition. I could spend an entire day talking about nutrition, but because of, for brevity's sake, well, nutrition is a passion of mine. I actually, when I was training to become a vascular neurologist at Columbia University, you know, when you're a neurologist and when you're in clinic and day after day somebody comes in, and I dealt with a lot of stroke patients and people who had vascular cognitive impairment. And so you see patients coming in, and at the end of the day, you do a cursory neurological exam, you get a good history, you talk to the family, you go over their medication, and you have only about 45 minutes to do all of this, and then prescribe medication, which are mostly antiplatelets, which is aspirin and Plavix, and a statin. And then you're walking out of the door, and you basically code for counseling. I spoke with a patient for 35 minutes, counseling them about lifestyle risk factors, and that's it. And you say, by the way, eat healthy, exercise, see you in 3 months. That's basically it. Sick and tired of that system, sick and tired. So what I did was we both decided that I wanted to go to culinary school, because at the end of the day, if you want somebody to eat healthy, it has to be delicious. So I'd be in the ICU in my scrubs in the morning, and I would take the train downtown at 7 p.m., and I'd be cutting vegetables. And in 2 years, I got my culinary degree, just for that reason. So I'm very passionate about nutrition, and my PhD is in nutritional epidemiology. Let's talk about the importance of nutrition in brain health, and specifically in Alzheimer's disease. Decades and decades of research has shown that a diet that is high in plant components seems to be the best. Now, I'm sure everybody's heard about the Mediterranean diet. I'm sure everybody's heard about this diet, or that diet, and diet du jour. When you break those dietary patterns down, what stands out are the plant components. It's the whole food plant-based component. We also know that saturated fats are associated with insulin resistance in the brain and in the periphery as well, which causes a lot of difficulty for the brain cells to use glucose, the fuel, to survive. And sugar causes a lot of inflammation in the brain. Now, when I say sugar, it's the pure sugar that is, found in baked goods. That is, the table sugar that we all talk about. Now, the American diet, unfortunately, is designed for disease. No wonder it's called a SAD diet, standard American diet. Most of it is refined and processed, consists of dairy and animal foods, and about 7% of it is plants. The American Heart Association puts out a progress report card every year to show how we're doing as far as the simple sevens are concerned. How are we doing as far as glucose, physical activity, smoking, and diet. We're doing really well when it comes to smoking. About 70+% of the population is not smoking. But when it comes to nutrition, you actually have to have a magnifying glass to see the statistics. Less than 1% of the population, adults 50 and above, eat a healthy diet, which is defined as fruits and vegetables and whole grains, nuts and seeds. They're mostly refined and mostly meat and cheese. This is what it looks like, unfortunately. This is the diet everywhere you go. And hopefully we're going to be able to change it to this, a whole food plant-based diet. Now I'll take some time to go over some of the research that supports this notion. The Chicago Health and Aging Project, one of their earlier papers back in 2003, showed that in 2,500 older adults, those who consumed higher amounts of saturated fats and trans fatty acids over a 6-year period actually had a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But those who ate fats that were derived from plants, which are polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats, had a lower risk. The Adventist Health Study, we work at Loma Linda University, which is the only blue zone here in the United States, and the only validated blue zone, which means they have their population and they study the different effects of nutrition and lifestyle measures on disease. Back in 1993, Dr. Paul Gim showed that individuals, about 3,000 of them, those who ate meat, including fish and chicken, I'll talk about fish later, they had twice the risk of developing dementia compared to vegetarians. So the Seventh-day Adventist population is a wonderful population to study because they have vegetarians and non-vegetarians, and this was a comparison study. The Kaiser Permanente Northern California group, this paper was published in 2009, in about 10,000 individuals, they found that people who had high cholesterol during their midlife had a 57% higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And even individuals who had borderline high cholesterol had a 23% higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. The Women's Health Study in Boston, 6,000 women followed for 4 years. Higher saturated fat intake was associated with a faster decline in their memory by 70%. But on the contrary, women who had the least amount of saturated fats in their diet had a brain function of a woman 6 years younger. So this was an imaging study, and they did neuropsych testing as well. It looked better, and it functioned better as well. The Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professional Follow-Up Study, huge study, 131,000 individuals followed for decades. And they found out that substituting plant proteins for animal proteins resulted in lower risk of both cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, general mortality, and cardiovascular mortality. It's almost a switch. When they increased plant protein intake, it resulted in a 10% decrease in overall mortality and a 12% decrease in cardiovascular mortality, including strokes. We believe that Alzheimer's disease has a very high correlation with vascular disease. So what's good for the heart is good for the brain, because the same vascularity that you see in the heart, you actually see more of it in the brain. So how can it not be good? Now, at Columbia University, I had the privilege of working with my mentors, and we found that people who ate a plant-based diet in the Northern Manhattan study had a lower risk of cognitive decline over a span of 6 years compared to those who ate a SAD diet, Standard American. Now, when it comes to fat, there's a lot of controversy. You see a lot of headlines on Time magazine, on different media. There's a war between people who believe that fat is good. There's a war between ketogenic diet and a plant-based diet. But lately, I think this paper was published earlier this year, a couple of months ago. People are coming back to understand data is there to support the notion that it's not the saturated fats at all. Gary Tobes was the guy who was responsible for this movement. Do you guys remember this on Time magazine, Eat Butter? And then there were other news that said, bacon is back. He's a journalist, and he believed that a high-fat diet was actually good for the brain. And he tried to demean carbohydrates, that carbs are bad. So this low-carb thing started back then. But even he was the author in one of this paper, and with Walter Willett, who's the chair of the nutrition department at Harvard University, now believes that the risk of coronary heart disease is reduced by replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats. So things are changing, and it's not about the carbs. Anyway, other dietary patterns when you look at MIND diet. Has anybody heard about the MIND diet? It's all over the news. So what is MIND diet? MIND diet is a hybrid of the Mediterranean diet with a DASH diet, or the diet low in salt. And that has been studied quite extensively. In this particular study published in 2015, they looked at 1,000 individuals, and they looked at adherence to a MIND diet. And people who adhered to the MIND diet aggressively had a 53% risk reduction for Alzheimer's disease. Just diet, adjusted for physical activity, mental activity, and everything else. Just diet. And even moderate adherence to this diet reduced risk by 35%. I had the privilege of working with the California teacher study. I studied 133 individuals, 133,000 female public school teachers in Southern California that are followed for about 25 years. And I was interested in understanding what the Mediterranean diet was and parsing the elements out and seeing how it's associated with stroke. So when you look at the Mediterranean diet score, it's funny because some people think it's the wine and the cheese and the pasta. Nope, it's not. People get a high score when they consume vegetables, fruits, whole grains, nuts and seeds, and legumes. And fish is always brought up, but it's not the fish. It's actually the omega-3 fatty acid levels that are calculated. And if you have high levels, you tend to get a higher score in the Mediterranean diet trajectory. Low score is given for meat, poultry, and dairy, whether it's high or low fat. And what I found out was that if you create a scoring system, higher adherence to a Mediterranean diet reduced risk of stroke significantly. But the good news is it was not an all or none phenomenon. Every small incremental change towards a more plant-based components of the Mediterranean diet actually made a difference. So when you hear Mediterranean diet, it's actually the greens, the beans, legumes, the whole grain elements that seem to be healthier, and it's not the olive oil and it's not the fish at all. So what about fish? You always hear that fish is healthy. But when you look at studies, when they study food patterns, they always compare fish with red meat, processed meat, and chicken. Obviously, it's going to be better. But is fish better than a whole food plant-based diet? There's no evidence to that. Is fish better than legumes? No. Are legumes better than fish? Absolutely. So as far as the complex starches and the clean protein that's available in legumes, they're far more superior than fish. Now, there is no benefit for cognitive function with fish consumption and the omega-3 supplementation that is derived from fish in studies among healthy older adults. And we all know that we've contaminated our oceans with mercury and with PCBs. And these actually tend to be neurotoxic. They're contaminants. Matter of fact, there are studies that have shown that people who consume a lot of seafood tend to have lower cognitive function as far as neuropsychological testing is concerned. So we say skip the middle fish. And if you are going to get your omega-3 fatty acids, get it from whole food plant-based diet or an algae-based DHA and EPA supplementation. We did some studies on diabetes and insulin resistance. And we see that diabetes, people who have high glucose levels persistently or are used to a high glycemic index foods, they tend to have higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of people who actually call Alzheimer's disease as a type 3 diabetes. And that's because the insulin resistance and the glucose abnormalities associated with diabetes actually are a big propellant of this whole process of cognitive impairment. We also studied insulin resistance. This was a paper that we published last year. So insulin resistance is when your body doesn't recognize glucose molecules and it can't use it because of the profound amount of sugar and glucose in there. Absolutely saturated fat has to do with it as well. But the most interesting thing we found out was you don't necessarily have to have a diagnosis of diabetes to have slow decline in cognitive function. Even mild blips or raises in glucose level on a regular basis actually puts you at a higher risk for developing cognitive impairment in a nationally representative sample. Now, as far as supplementation, vitamins and minerals are concerned, I can't tell you how many times we have individuals coming in with bags and bags and bags of vitamins to our clinic. We call it the plastic bag syndrome. We kind of know, like, oh, there's another one coming in with the supplements. Now, most of the randomized clinical trials actually have failed to show any benefits of supplementation in people who have normal levels of vitamins. Granted, people who have low levels of, say, for example, vitamin D or vitamin B12 or omega-3 fatty acids, they need to replace them. But in individuals who don't, there actually is no use, there's no need for supplementation. The one thing that keeps coming up consistently is omega-3 fatty acids and its benefit for brain development, whether it's in children, pregnant women, and elderly. So low DHA levels have been associated with lower decline, and we do recommend for individuals who have mild cognitive impairment or who are on a whole food plant-based diet to take a supplementation for that. And vitamin B12 as well. If vitamin B12s are in the low normal levels, we want to replace them, especially for plant-based, people who are on a plant-based diet. So just to summarize everything, so what is the ideal diet for brain health and one that can potentially reduce the risk for Alzheimer's disease? Well, it's the one that emphasizes a whole food plant-based diet. It eliminates meat, poultry, and dairy, and specifies consumptions of food that are high in anti-inflammatory compounds, specifically greens, beans, berries, and vegetables and fruits in general. So an everyday meal would look like this: green leafy vegetables, 1 or 2 servings of them, cruciferous vegetables, other vegetables, berries, nuts and seeds, beans and lentils, whole grain. Herbs and spices are high in anti-inflammatory compounds, and tea and coffee as well. Fruits and dark chocolate, especially if it's low in sugar, that's fine. And work towards eliminating sugar. When I say sugar, it's pure sugar or foods that are have high glycemic index. And we're talking about baked goods and pastries and sweets and juices without the pulp and without the fiber. Meats, all kinds of meats. Pastries and sweets, cheese and dairy, which are high source of saturated fats, and extracted plant oils, including tropical oils. And I'm sorry to say that, I've had a lot of coconut today. It was beautiful, it was delicious, but extracted tropical oils like coconut oil and palm oil, or the few plant oils that are very high in saturated fats. 93% saturated fats in coconut oil only, and that causes inflammation in the vascularity of the brain. And so there is a consensus that one should be guarded when it comes to a use of coconut oil. And I'll let you talk about exercise a little bit.
Now, the way we approach this, because we're in the clinic and the communities, is that we are not an all or none. Our approach is success-based. So that's actually the most important aspect of what we do in the communities, at homes, and the clinic. It's critical that we create successes in the communities, at homes, and it's in small steps. My definition of motivation is when there's a purpose or a path or a point that you want to reach, and you create small steps of success, and those steps are individualized. And then the brain actually fills in emotion. I like it or I don't like it. If you're succeeding, it's I like it. That becomes motivation. That becomes repeated. That has to be how it has to be done. So when we see a person who's in churches and in communities, we don't say, go vegan tomorrow. We would fail everybody, in fact. So we say, give me your list of foods you eat. And we have a whole list, and then we say, which one of these do you think it's easier for you to reduce? That's why we have WTE and WTI. WTE is work towards eliminating. The WT part is most important. And WTI, work towards increasing. And you do one behavior at a time. You didn't get to this point overnight. Don't get out of it overnight. That's the whole mentality of medicine. Trying to get people out of depression with one pill over 6 weeks. It doesn't work like that. They're trying to get people. So small steps. If it's sugar, quantify it, reduce it by half for the next 2 months and see how you do. And then the next thing is the saturated fat. Not all of it. Is it cheese? Do you think you can succeed? Pick that. And then change that by a certain measurable, SMART goals. Specific, measurable, attainable, achievable, and relevant to your goal, and time bound. Within 6 weeks, I'm going to reduce my cheese consumption by this much. Meat consumption, and all of it should not be done at the same time. One behavior, succeed in that, then go to the next behavior. And you will be shocked what you will achieve in 1 year, where you have failed in so many New Year resolutions. So it's all small steps with nutrition. Exercise. Exercise is very, very important, more than we thought. So whereas out of the 5 components, nutrition, stress, and sleep create the milieu, create the environment for the brain to thrive, physical exercise and mental exercise actually grow the brain, literally grow the brain. And there's plenty of data that shows that people who exercise regularly, and you all have read the latest papers from Harvard and other places, where people who exercised and had a brisk walk on a regular basis had bigger brains. Not just retrospectively, prospectively, meaning they followed people over time and they saw their brains grew. This is in the context of the fact that after a certain age, and I don't want to tell you that age because you're going to be scared, it's younger than you thought, your brain starts shrinking. That's okay. We have way more neurons than we need. There are many cases of people with half of the brain loss from hydrocephalus and were able to achieve. I had a patient like that. Half the brain loss from hydrocephalus during childhood, slowly obviously. And this person was able to achieve a PhD cum laude from Ivy League school. Now, the number of neurons is not as important as the connectivity. Remember, each neuron can make a few connections or as many as 30,000 connections. So we've seen brains grow, not so much with new neurons, although we thought there was a time that we thought there was no new neurons created. Now we know there are some new neurons created, but that's nothing. What is incredible is the connections, which you have control over, through mental activity and physical activity. So exercise is critical. It actually has been shown to stop the shrinkage and increase growth, but also increase cognitive activity, as well as reduce your chances of dementia by 48% in one study. The data shows three factors that are important in exercise. 1, you need to exercise a little more than you thought you did. When patients come to me and say, oh, don't worry about exercise, I'm exercising all the time. What do? I do gardening, or I walk the neighborhood. That's fantastic, but that's meditation. That's not exercise. And continue doing that. And I do walking meditation. I love walking meditation. But exercise means you have to get tired. And so the ideal is, and this is work towards increasing. Don't expect to get there tomorrow. This is in 6 months, in a year. 25 to 30 minutes of vigorous exercise 4 to 5 days a week. Exercise should be at the center in your living space because it's more likely to happen, much less likely to be inhibited by other things like wearing fancy clothes for gyms. So in any case, that's one part. The number two is, even if you are exercising half an hour a day, 4 to 5 days a week, and you're not moving the rest of the time, you're just sitting, it negated the benefit. So move throughout the day. Last time we were here, I got everybody right about now to stand up and stretch. So why don't you guys stand up and stretch? So you should never be sitting for more than 50 minutes to an hour and stretch. So. And then the third component, while you're standing, is leg strength. So number one was aerobic exercise. You have to do more than you thought. Number two is move throughout the day. Number three is leg strength seems to be associated with brain strength. And initially there was a question why that was the case, or is it maybe reverse causation? But we really think that leg strength is important because the biggest pump in your body is not your heart, it's your legs. Biggest metabolism takes place in your legs. So we tell people, if you get up, hold on to something, do mini squats. Mini squats. And as often as you can, get those legs stronger because the blood from your legs get pumped back to your brain, not because of your heart. It's the muscles of your legs that pump it. So get the legs strong. So those are 3 factors for exercise. Next is stress. So stress is incredibly detrimental. And we'll talk about why we talk about unwind. Because there's a good stress and there is a bad stress. If anything, the most important aspect of health, of life, is good stress, and you'll see why we say that. So bad stress is the kind of stress that is not yours, that's not driven by your purpose, doesn't have an end, clear end, it's not time bound, and it's just, so, when people who experience chronic bad stress have smaller brains. People who have chronic bad stress have high cortisol levels, their inflammatory factors are higher, and even their amyloid levels are higher. So bad stress is incredibly detrimental over a long time, and the mechanisms are fairly straightforward. Your brain, your limbic system, your emotional brain, which is the limbic structures in the brain, is directly connected to the hypothalamus, which is then connected to the pituitary, which is the hormones of the body, and it controls your immune system, your thyroid system, everything. So obviously, somebody who's having bad stress, of course the neurotransmitters, is going to affect the brain and the rest of the body. Now, good stress is the type that's driven by your purpose, that has a time bound, that you actually feel the tension, and the tension is a good tension. What kind of stress are we talking about? Education, you're taking classes for yourself. You're actually challenging yourself to do things. And when I get to optimize, I'll tell you what that means. So good stress is incredibly important because good stress, as much as we would like to say nutrition, seems to be more important for brain resilience than anything else. Okay, and bad stress we talked about. So the first thing with stress there is to identify your stress. In our household, we have whiteboards everywhere. So what we do is every time somebody has inspiration, they go to the whiteboard and write things. But with stress, what we do every often, and Alex and Sophie will attest to that, we go there and identify, really circumscribe, define what are my bad stresses and what are my good stresses. My good stresses, I'm trying to learn guitar. Well, it's good stress for me, bad stress for them, hearing my guitar. Yeah, yeah, it's really bad. So, and bad stress is a job or a part of a job that's been assigned to me that I don't like, that I've been doing year after year. Bad stress is a thought that's lingering in my head that I've never addressed. Write all these stressors down. Those stressors, if not applied, not addressed, will have the greatest effect long term. So identify them, circumscribe them, And it's unusual that two neurologists are talking about something that's almost like management, but it is. At the core of everything is life management, and identify good stress and bad stress. And plan to reduce the bad stress through delegation, elimination, whatever you have to do, and increase the good stress. I can't emphasize how important that is. And the second thing is multitasking. Completely separate thing. So we talk about management, now we talk about multitasking. There is no such thing as multitasking. Only doing many things poorly. There is no multitasking. Your brain is not programmed and is not designed for multitasking. So as much as you think you're doing a great job, you would be doing a much better job if you do tasks in linear fashion and do them well and then go to the next thing. And multitasking creates an urgency state living. A lot of people think that they're getting a lot of work done, but they're living from urgency to urgency, from emergency to emergency, not driven by the vision, by the outcome, long-term outcome. And that creates tension. So it's critical that you organize in a way where you're not multitasking and you're getting things done. And that sense of accomplishment, that check mark, that turns on dopamine. And that's your addiction. That's the thing that makes you feel good. So accomplishing and succeeding one linear event at a time creates success. By the way, we have an entire talk on stress management. We did this for AT&T. And it's incredibly important because at the center of our program, it's ironically, we're a nutritionist center. It's not nutrition, it's not exercise, it's actually management of life's health. The third thing is purpose. At the core of everything you do should be a purpose. It's something that's driven by you. Purpose is not a magical word that I'm going to save the rainforest. That would be good if you do, but that's not the point. Whatever, for me to learn guitar or a few songs, that's a purpose for now. And identify your purposes and let that lead your process. And lastly, a separate thing is create islands of mindfulness and meditation and focus. The whole purpose of mindfulness training and meditation is creating higher levels of cognitive focus. An example of that I give is chess players. I don't know how many of you guys have ever played chess. In chess, when you first start, you're a 2-level player. Somebody moves a pawn, how am I going to, just one reactionary. Then it's the next level, and then 10 level, and then 15 level. You have chess players that can blindfold, and with a blindfold can play 20 people because they have everything in their mind. The only way you can achieve that level of cognitive capacity is through focus. And if there's anything I would teach people as far as building their cognition, is forget about everything else. Work on focus first. Meditation and mindfulness, if just used for that purpose, is more than enough. It has other purposes as well. But start developing the focus through those islands. By the way, all of you who think that, oh, I can't do meditation because I lose focus, guess what? That's actually a success. Because every time you lose focus and come back to it, you're actually building that muscle of focus. Not literal muscle, but that connection. So that's not a failure. You do a minute of meditation or mindfulness. What we do is mindful breathing with the kids as well. So 2 times a day, 1 minute to 3 minutes, work your way up of this breathing and relaxing and focusing creates these islands of awareness about tension and about your tension. And it's incredible. For us who are quite incredulous about these things, I can assure you, this is part of our life. So it has helped us quite a bit. The next thing is sleep. As Ayesha says, none of us sleep like this anymore, but it's incredibly important. It had to be important. We wouldn't have sacrificed 8 hours of safety, knocked out, for those bears to come and maul us. There's a reason. Sleep is incredibly important, yet in a fast-paced world, none of us create the environment for good sleep. Sleep is incredibly important because it has 2 main functions. One is memory and cognitive consolidation. Organizes your memories and thoughts. Puts it into the right folders and files, metaphorically. And we know that people who don't get good sleep on a regular basis, their memory is poor, they do much worse in tests. Somebody on the Sunday talked about the MIT study where people, so many studies have shown that people who don't get good sleep even though they feel like they're refreshed because they went to the Starbucks in the morning, they do poorly throughout the day. The second purpose of sleep is even more important. We were the director of Brain Health Center at Cedars-Sinai, and she detected my, okay. We saw a lot of people from Hollywood and other places, and they're wonderful, and we saw all kinds of detox, every kind of detox you can think of, from every body pore you can imagine. We're not going to get gruesome here. But we tell them, that we keep saying there are two kinds of detox we know of scientifically. One is water. Water is critical. As we get older, our proportion of water goes down, actually. And water is important because it's actually the mechanism through which all our biochemical processes take place. The second detox is sleep. Sleep, actually, people who don't get one night's good sleep, their inflammatory markers go up, even their amyloid levels go up, their cortisol levels go up. So it's critical that we develop a culture aware of sleep. We're not aware of sleep as a population. And when these levels go up, the common belief is, it's okay, I'll make it up on the weekend. You can't make it up on the weekend. That's the one thing about sleep, you can't make it up. Another type of sleep disorder is sleep apnea, which is underdiagnosed, even more undertreated. If a person has sleep apnea, their chances of Alzheimer's, in some studies have shown, to go up as much as 70%. So if you think you have sleep problems, if you're not getting restful sleep, meaning going through all those 4 cycles, please address it with your sleep doctor. And there's so much that can be done to address sleep disorders, and we have a whole talk about sleep. But please address it, because if your sleep disorder is addressed, you will see a complete turnaround as far as your memory and cognition and everything else. The last one, and I think the most important, is optimizing mental activity. You have 2 components of brain reserve. One is brain reserve, which is what happens to your brain, or what brain is left after the age of 5 or 6. You know, at age 3, you have the most neurons in your brain, and then there's what's called culling or pruning, where a large number of cells die off, apoptosis, and the brain that's left behind is the brain you have, the architecture. A lot of that is determined by genetics, but a lot of it in environment. So we talk about environment in the first 5 years of life is so critical to determine brain reserve. What happens thereafter is cognitive reserve. The brain bank, the bank account that protects, that's what we all have to work around. Remember I talked about exercise and mental activity? Those two actually create the cognitive reserve. The redundancy that can withstand small microvascular disease, the blood pressure problems, the cholesterol problems, or even head trauma. It's the brain reserve that determines that. Up to now, the only thing we actually use as a measure of brain reserve in studies is education. So a high school education gives you this many points, a college education this many, the multiple degrees gives you this many. But that's not true, because otherwise poor Bill Gates and Steve Jobs would have been in trouble. They had 1 year of college. But it's actually not education, it's mental activity. Keeping your mind challenged. That's the critical factor, which creates profound protection. Let me give you a metaphor, an example. Here's a piece of memory. This is not really how it works in the body, but it's a good picture. Here's a piece of memory, and here's you trying to get to that piece of memory. There are 2 connections. At age 50, you had an episode of high blood pressure, and this one connection is severed. At age 30 earlier, you had a bad night of lots of drinking, hopefully not, but let's say you did, and this one was severed. That memory is lost in space forever. Now you have, let's say you have reserve, so you have 30,000 connections. That redundancy will not be destroyed by any amount of partying. Don't party that much, but I'm saying nothing will eliminate that level of redundancy. And that redundancy is your protection. So, and how do you get that redundancy? How you get that redundancy is through these 3 factors. Complexity first. We did one of the largest meta-analysis, which was published about 2 months ago, which looked at all the studies that were done on brain games and brain activities and MCI, mild cognitive impairment, and what worked. Complexity was the most important thing. Complexity means activities that are challenging multiple parts of the brain. Now, again, I'm going to pick on Sudoku because nobody owns it, so I won't get sued, but Sudoku is great. It's wonderful, but it's adding some numbers to 9 is one part of the brain. But let's say you're playing a musical instrument like piano. You have to read the notes. That's your language centers. You have to process that information. That's your frontal lobe. You have to be creative. That's your right parietal lobe. Not, it doesn't exactly work like that, but in some ways it does. Then you have to see the process. That's your occipital lobe. The motor cortex is affected when you're playing the keyboards. And most importantly, your limbic emotional centers are involved in that as well. That's no Sudoku. That's the entire brain being challenged. So complex activities like playing musical instruments, new songs, dancing, learning dances, writing a book, other activities such as a new project that you lead, or volunteering, or anything that means you're doing multiple things, multiple parts of the brain is fantastic. Playing cards with a group of 4 people 3 times a week, that's the best because it's social activity, it's mental activity. So that's the kind of complexity we're talking about. The next component is challenge. So you could be doing something that's complex, but it's repeated multiple times, so it's no longer challenging. To you, it's repetitive. It's almost like reflex. It's habit. Whatever you're doing that's complex must challenge your brain. So only you know what's the next level. Keep challenging yourself further and further. That's what actually pushes that muscle. That's what makes those connections. So always challenge yourself. The one determinant factor, the highest determinant factor of cognitive decline was people who were highly functioning, they retired, and they didn't do anything for several years. Their decline was the steepest, more than anybody else's. So challenge your brain continuously. And third, and most important, is purpose. What determines the pivot point between good stress and bad stress is purpose. Literally. I mean, we thought about this long and hard. How do we decide what's good stress and bad stress? And the one word that kept coming back is, if it serves my purpose, and it's a higher purpose, then it's a good stress. You know, if I'm taking classes as a senior, and I'm choosing the classes and it's not histology, it's a good stress. I hate histology. And if I'm doing guitar at my age, it's a good stress. And if I'm project managing for a charitable organization, it's a lot of work, probably more work than you could ever imagine, but it's a good stress because it's driven by your purpose. And repeatedly it's been shown that people that are doing those kind of activities, they thrive more than anything else. So those 3 factors determine not just health, not just brain health, but health in general. So, yeah. And then the last thing is the first thing I said, which is for us, healthcare is not in the clinic and the hospital. It's in the home and in the community. That's why everything we do, our books, the kids have written the books to support them. All of the money that they make will go into the charity, which is for the communities. Educating communities about brain health, educating communities about elements in their lifestyle that can affect their brain health, because that's the tsunami we need. Thank you so much.
Mahalo for coming and have a safe return home. Good night.